My pleasure to introduce somebody, and as I said, who probably doesn't need introduction because she's been here since the beginning and is sort of deeply connected across the regional councils. But Victoria Ackroyd sort of joined our group. I mean, she started working as a postdoc in my lab, feels like almost 8 years ago, or maybe longer, I don't know. And she came in with fresh out of some experience helping the Midwest Cover Crop Council with some of their data verification steps for their decision tool. And the postdoc was framed as, let's build one for the Northeast. And over the several year period, Victoria helped to orchestrate with a number of other key partners in the Northeast Cover Crop Council, the whole data verification process and tool development for the Northeast Cover Crop Council's species selector tool, and has gone on to work with the Southerners to adapt that tool to data verification process in the Southern. She's been instrumental in the development of the nitrogen calculator, user interface and beta testing. She does a lot of train the trainer activities with the decision tools, and she sort of serves as sort of a key coordinator for extension outreach with our web tools, as well as like these train the trainer activities. She serves as the project manager for the Northeast Cover Crop Council and wears many, many, many hats in PSA. So it's with great pleasure to introduce Victoria.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm excited to be here today talking about two tools. The species selector has been online for a little over a year, and the nitrogen calculator came online at the beginning of this year. And so my apologies if some of you have seen some of these slides before, but hopefully there will be something interesting in here for you as well. I also want to apologize in advance. It's allergy season here in the Mid-Atlantic, so I'll try not to blow the trumpet too much. With that said, let me go on ahead and get the slideshow going. And I should share my screen because I bet you can't see it otherwise. Share screen. Okay. So just to give you and remember how to advance slides. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to do today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the environment in which each tool has been developed. And then for both the species selector and CCN calc, I'm going to go on ahead and do a overview of history, and then, as requested, a very brief demo of each tool. Then we'll have some time for questions, and I'll be honest with you, I know a lot of us book ourselves back to back, so it is my aim to be done a little bit before noon so you can get a cup of tea before your next call. So with that said, the environment in which the tools were developed. Effective cover cropping is knowledge intensive. As we know, cover crops provide a wide range of ecological services. They help to cut down on soil erosion. They can provide pollinator habitat. They help reduce nutrient leaching. There's a lot of uses for cover crops, but it's a fact that they do add to the management complexity of systems. And this complexity incurs a cognitive burden. There's a lot of things to balance. You've got both cash and cover crop genetics to deal with. You've got environmental conditions, which can be incredibly variable year to year. You've got cultural practices, everything from no-till up to traditional tillage, and various pest management strategies. And then there's just the fact that the overall system has to work. And when you add cover crops to this mix, it can feel like just that little bit extra that maybe isn't worth the time to deal with. However, luckily, cover cropping very much is collaborative. There's a lot of resources in existence. Managing cover crops profitably, what we like to joke, is the Bible for cover cropping. NRCS has a wide range of tools. Many of them are, Excel sheets running macros, but they're incredibly in-depth and intensive. And then starting back in the mid-2000s, the Midwest Cover Crops Council developed a cover crop species selector. They kind of blazed the trail. They were the first cover crop council and the first to come up with a tool. However, private industry is certainly in on it too. Grassland Oregon has a tool. So there's a wide range of resources that are out there. Whoops. However, when we were looking around this environment and surveying these resources, we realized that there were still some key information challenges. Data is siloed because there's a lack of integration of existing data across agricultural systems and scales. And these groups don't necessarily talk to each other. You know, the blueberry growers don't necessarily know what the corn growers are doing. And sometimes there is, you know, something good there that they could make use of. There's a fragmented landscape of decision support tools that are not adaptive, interoperable, or user-friendly. I mean, how many times have you been sent a link to a cool looking piece of software and then you start to fiddle with it, and within 30 seconds you're like, I'm not spending the time to deal with this, and you just click out of it? That's a pretty common reaction, you know? It's a cognitive burden. There's a lot of information out there to deal with these days, and things have got to be user-friendly, and they have to take into account the needs of their users. Decision support tools do not necessarily consider how farmers and stakeholders use data to manage complex dynamic systems. And finally, there was a lack of site-specific recommendations. So for example, managing cover crops profitably is an awesome resource, but if you go into there and you look at the range of like nitrogen accumulation for legumes, you realize that it's a huge range. And so that's great for just general knowledge of, you know, the upper and lower limits, but it doesn't necessarily help someone in Maine versus North Carolina to reasonably understand how much nitrogen that hairy vetch is going to put on for them. So luckily, these challenges have been recognized by a lot of groups, including the Precision Sustainable Agriculture team, but also, you know, NRCS, Northeast SARE, and the various cover crop councils. And so these groups have all been working to support innovation in cover crop technologies. Right now, there's a lot of existing data and tools that are underlying the species selector and the nitrogen calculator. We absolutely do not want to reinvent the wheel with these tools, and we absolutely do not feel that it's necessary to reinvent the wheel. You know, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. And so, for example, the species selector has pulled from existing cover crop council tools. It's pulled from existing NRCS tools, such as Paul Ceylon has a seeding rate calculator he's put together. Just in terms of the very simplest types of data, even, you know, anyone here, can you think right now of what we're calling oilseed radish? Yeah, I can't either. That's why we consult things like itis.gov to pull the correct Latin name, the currently recognized Latin name. USDA Plants Database has a lot of useful information in it. SURGO, the funniest acronym of them all, and yet it drives Web Soil Survey, and it's a really cool database to be able to pull into your tools. And then finally, unique to the PSA group is this weather data API that we've created. It turns out that your hard-earned taxpayer money goes to collect weather data, but in order to access it, you usually have to pay some kind of like a subscription-based service to use their interface to reach the data. And we just kind of realized that wasn't sustainable for our group. And so luckily we did have the skills and the talent to pull together an API of our own to access that otherwise free data. And then finally, we absolutely cannot talk about tools without talking about the various experts across, in this case, USDA hardiness zones 3 through 10 in the Eastern US, who have gone through and vetted data, have done beta testing for both data, have provided input at every step of the way when these tools have been created. So it's worth mentioning that I'm focusing on the species selector and CCN calc today, but there's a lot of tools that PSA, various groups in PSA are working on. You know, there's a species seeding rate and mixture selection tool in the works. There's an economics tool. There's weed management folks working on a tool. The various attempts at you know, spatial mapping of cover crop performance, you could consider that to be a tool. And so PSA really does have a lot of pots on the stove working in the tool ecosystem. So I've talked in general about the background that underlies, you know, both tools, and now I'd kind of like to go into some more specifics on the species selector itself. And if you go to this website, covercrop.tools, it is an HTTPS website. This is a landing page that you'll see, and we'll get into why some of the quirks in a few minutes. But anyway, background. So like I said, our starting point for the data for this tool We pulled cover crop data from the Midwestern tool. We've pulled it from various NRCS tools. We've relied on ITIS, USDA Plants Database, and then Surgo and the Weather Data API. Our tool is what you call an expert opinion-based tool. So information like the Latin names from itis.gov, that's not really going to be controversial. But the ratings and rankings for the various cover crops, that absolutely is something that has to be talked out by folks who are familiar with the cover crops, because while there's some literature out there, there's not enough literature to populate the tool, and it's not really set up to be useful for, you know, very subjective ratings and rankings where you're comparing species necessarily. And so we always want to recognize our cover crop zone teams who have gone through and helped us to refine these data so that they are site specific enough to be able to provide some not totally specialized, but more specialized recommendations than would otherwise be possible. It's a lot of moving parts to put together a tool. You know, we've got everything from our zone team leaders to the development team, the programmers, the folks who deal with the logic, the folks who run the beta testing. And we most definitely want to say thank you to everybody who has been involved in this process. Speaking of the process, I'm not going to walk through every step of this diagram. I just want you to have a sense of how iterative and interconnected it is, because what we did with the species selector tool is in the Midwest, they went by state, but how big is the Northeast compared to the Midwest? If we had gone by state in the Northeast, we would have been calling the same folks over and over again, because there's just a lot of states crammed into a relatively small geographic area. And so instead we chose to break it up by USDA hardiness zone. The far north of Maine is, you know, zone 3, and then you get down into Maryland and you've got zone 7. So all of these locations get freezing weather, but varying amounts and whatnot. And so what we did is we went zone by zone and we walked through the data. But the cool thing about this process was that, you know, zone 6 would maybe slightly alter a definition of a variable. And then we would take that back to the other zones briefly if needed. You know, we didn't belabor the point, but we'd go, you know, hey, zone 6 picked up on this. What do you guys think of this? Do you want to incorporate this into the data set for your zone? You know, a zone would come up with a way to rate the rankings. So, you know, 1 is least amount of tillage, it's a light plow, and 5 is the most amount of tillage, it's a heavy cardboard moldboard plow. And they would, you know, more clearly codify what they meant by the ratings or rankings. We would take that schema back to the other zones and we would offer them the chance to use it or adapt it if they felt it was appropriate for their zone. So it was very much a feedback process as we were going through these data to, at the same time, make sure that the data fit any given zone, but at the same time trying to keep things standardized as much as possible across zones, remembering we're interested in interoperability here. You know, we don't want, you know, 15 million different words that all mean the same thing floating around out in our data dictionary. And so it was just very much a feedback process among the various zone teams to make the data as robust as we could. Speaking of the data, so traditionally when you're dealing with data, you're probably dealing with Excel, and Excel has its uses, and the online version of Excel certainly has its uses too. I think that's Google Sheets, if I'm keeping that straight. But we were searching for a tool that would help us to jointly go through the data, but avoid some of the issues that you run into with some of the other tools. For example, data collisions. I know the wider PSA group ran into this too. The issue where you'd have 2 folks editing the same data point at the exact same time and things would get lost or mixed up as a result. We didn't want to deal with that. So we ended up using a utility called Airtable. It has the structure of a spreadsheet with the power of a database. And that actually means that it makes it super easy for our programmers to update the tool. So if we find a typo or we realize information is missing, it's really easy for us to fix it and then ask the programmers to run their quick script, and they can shove the changes into the online tool really quick. Now, I know that they use a production environment. We don't go directly from Airtable to the online functioning tool, because sometimes things happen when you meddle in the guts of a tool. But the point here simply is that originally, the Midwest tool did not have a way to easily update data. They've since done a change, a facelift, and can update their data, and we can as well. But moving back to Airtable, it tracks changes, it allows folks to comment, it enables collaboration, it keeps everything in the same place. And that's really a big deal when you're dealing with the number of data points that we're dealing with. Because we did have to deal with an awful lot of data points for the species selector tool. So what we did first off is we seriously surveyed the landscape, okay? We spent literally, I think it was over a year, talking to stakeholders, looking at the Midwest tool, looking at other tools, and talking about what the tool needed to be in the Northeast. And then ultimately we ended up, identifying the data set that we wanted to work with and chunking it so that it kind of made sense and it was more digestible. Nobody wants to look at a spreadsheet with 1,000 rows in it. It boggles the human mind. But if you break that 1,000 rows up into, 50 rows of agronomic data and 50 rows of, planting data and so on, it can still be a lot, but it's a lot more doable. And then in terms of interoperability, of transparency, of being user-friendly and friendly for the developers of other tools, we've also made it a point of always putting together a data dictionary, which is literally just a sheet where we spell out every single one of our variables. We define it, we talk about whether it's numerical or it's written, we talk about where it comes into use, we talk about where the data came from, this data source thing. And basically it just helps us to keep track of the data. And it also helps other people to understand where we're coming from and where we're going with any given variable. This was important because we did have 5 plant hardiness zone data sets to deal with, 64 total cover crops, not all 64 in every single zone. They were subsets, but 64 total. I think Maryland might have had the fewest at like 25, and I think, or that would have been zone 7, sorry. And zone 5, which is, roughly New York, had maybe 40. So it varied depending on what folks felt was necessary for their zone. 117 variables divided into 9 categories. So 117 variables times 64 cover crops, because if you rate it for one, you got to rate it for all. That's a lot of data. And this just gives you a sense of what our data experts were looking at, our verification experts were looking at when they were going through and helping us to tweak things. So we absolutely did not expect our folks to generate data de novo from scratch. We did not. We pulled data from the nearest relevant source. So I think we started with zone 6. And so that was Ohio in the Midwest. Ohio is mostly zone 6. And so I populated Airtable to begin with for zone 6 from the Ohio version of the Midwestern tool. And then from there, we went in and we tweaked things. We used a scale where 1 was usually worst and 5 was usually best. And we ran into a lot of linguistic issues too. There's so many things to think about when you're putting together these tools, because you want the ratings to be standardized. You don't want to confuse your users by having different ratings that mean different things. But when you're talking about like cover crop impact on pests, best and worst, what do you actually mean? And so we got to be very careful with our definitions and spelling out what the ratings meant in cases where there might be linguistic difficulties. So now I'm going to go on ahead and get out of the slideshow view for a minute, and I'm actually going to do a very brief, 5-minute demo of the tool. So if you can't see my screens, Sarah, please yell at me, but I think I'm still screen sharing. So when you come to https://covercrop.tools, feel free to do so, by the way. I can't see any of you. But I always encourage folks who are sitting in on these sorts of things to pull up their phone, their tablet, another tab on their computer, and goof off along with me, because honestly, we have resources here to help you, but at the same time, we did want these things to be user-friendly and somewhat intuitive. So speaking of resources, before I actually go into the demo of the tool, I want to point out a couple of key features that made us relatively unique. So first off, we have an about page, and it is literally all the background that you could want about this tool. We're working on manuscripts based on the tools, but we're not there yet. And so if you ever need, information for whatever reason, this is a good starting point, or you're also certainly welcome to, email me or anyone associated with the lab, and we can figure out how to get you what you need. A lot of the folks that helped us were early career faculty. A lot of folks are going after tenure, or else they're extension folks and whatnot. Of course, we had, industry involved, we had farmers involved, we had government folks, ARS and NRCS involved as well. But in any case, we know that it's always really important that where possible, you provide recognition, because, people are choosing to do this on their work time, and they need to be able to point to the fact that this is what they were doing. So there's a lot of interesting things in the about page, but I'm not further going to belabor it, except to point out that it does exist and it can be a useful resource if you ever have a minute. The help page is set up with a PowerPoint that will walk you through using the tool if for whatever reason you want to take the guided tour of the tool, and some pretty thorough directions. And it's also got frequently asked questions. And I really want to point this out because you're going to run into the things in the tool that are going to make you scratch your head. For example, forage brassica. What in the devil does forage brassica mean? Well, we tell you right here, we're talking about hybrids of B. oleracea and B. napus. And we talk a little bit about, what they're used for and whatnot. But when you're not quite sure what the common name is referring to and the Latin name is not helping you that much, the FAQs can help. The other thing that can help in here is later on, we'll get to talking about goals for the cover crops, but we don't have every goal under the sun in this tool. It's simply not a good idea because at some point you have so much information that you start to overload your users. And so we had to balance thorough with overwhelming. But sometimes you want an answer to how can I improve soil water quality. And so we provide some suggestions for how to come up with that based on the existing goals, just picking combinations of goals. They would feed into something like improve water quality. Finally, the feedback page. This is my personal favorite page because this is the page that allows us to continue improving. When we set up to make a tool, we set up to do what we call a minimum viable product. We want something that's workable, that's useful, that's usable, but we absolutely understand that, we have to get these tools out sooner rather than later. And so there's this understanding that, future versions will be a thing. And so feedback from people like you guys and the folks that you guys interact with is very helpful for coming up with kind of what you might think of as a wish list. It's also useful if you find a typo or something that looks like a typo. Feel free, if the website's not working or something's not working for you, hit us up on the feedback page. If you can't even get the feedback page to work, email me. Don't think that's ever happened. Now, there is a case where you may find a rating that you don't agree with. You are certainly welcome to email us or to hit the feedback page on that. And it's totally cool and encouraged that you do so. However, think about the debate about radish and compaction. There's some evidence in the literature that radish helps to break up compaction. And there's some evidence in the literature that when the radish hits a compacted zone, it goes sideways. And so that's kind of an example of a question that has not been fully resolved and that people might have different opinions on. And we generally recognized those sticky wickets when we came to them in the data. But you certainly might not agree with the rating we came up with, and you're certainly welcome to let us know that. We do plan to review the data as needed, but some things can't be immediately addressed. So, however, with that said, let's go into an actual quick demo. So there's two modules to this tool, okay? So I've clicked on the Cover Crop Explorer. You see this green tab, and this is the landing page. And this is what we like to think of as, for the somewhat advanced user, this is more of a learning tool than an actual selector tool, because you can view crop details and you can add plants to the list, and then you can look at your list and you can just basically trawl the data that are in this tool and maybe learn something in the process, or maybe you're looking for something specific and you just want to verify by looking at the tool. You're certainly welcome to do that. If you want to take the more straightforward way, you can also go to the actual wizard, the CPC selector tool. That's the rightmost tab. And so we've got some caveats here about our purpose. Always, 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 anyone who is participating in cost share or any other government program needs to run their plans by whoever their program contact is to make sure that what they are planning to do lines up with the program in which they are participating. We want this tool to be useful and usable, but at the same time, we have not incorporated all of the program guidelines into it. And so, farmers who are involved in those programs need to go back to their program contact and double check that what they've come up with is acceptable to their program. With that caveat out of the way, we have this really cool location page now. It took us forever to come up with this, but you can start filling in your address and it'll fill in your plant hardiness zone, and you can leave it at that. Or if you want to get more specific, there's places where you've got a huge number of fields. You can draw your field just like you can in Web Soil Survey. Finish and click finish there. Or you can drop a point and be more specific than just the street address. And what this does then is you click next, go down to next, and it pulls from Surgo to tell you what your soil conditions are. Except that in this case it hasn't, but that doesn't really matter because whatever it does, you can change it if you need to. Web Soil Survey is only accurate down to a certain size area, and we know that. And human activity sometimes will change things if you've got drainage or tileage or tiles or whatever, and so you can change these values. Then you go next, and that good old weather API is going to give you some background information about your climate conditions. Right now, this isn't taken into account when generating recommendations, but in the future, I have high hopes. Anyway, finally, the first major decision point in the species selector tool is your cover cropping goals. And so it's worth pointing out that when you mouse over anything, it'll give you an in-depth definition of what we mean. And so you pick something, nitrogen fixation and prevent fall erosion. You can pick up to 3. And here's the first cut. And if this doesn't look right, because 5 means best, then you go up to this little 3-line button and it sorts that away instead. Excuse me. Okay. And so we've got it sorted from best to worst. If you skim down, you will see that where it grays out, anything that's rated 2 or lower gets screened out at this point. And then you can just take a wander around. You can look at the calendar view if you're more interested in what matches your goal needs, but you're also concerned about your planting timing. If you'd rather see more information, you can go back to your list view like this. The second major point at which you can really start screening things out is all these filters on the left. And honestly, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but it's also kind of cool and very versatile because you can get creative with it if you want to. So you can, tell it, I only want to see legumes. I want to see things that are, annual. That's not going to delete too many for me. There's all sorts of filters on the left, and I don't have much time to go through the rest of this, but I would very much encourage you to play with this and also to play with the add to list feature. This is a feature in both the species selector and the cover crop explorer. And once you've got it set up like this, you can go to comparison view And you can use the same filters on the left, and you can get really in depth. You can say, I want something that has heat tolerance, you know, and you can look at what it's rated for heat tolerance. Sun hemp would be your best choice there. So there's a lot of things you can do with these filters and these ratings, and we do hope that this tool is both useful and usable. And if you have a thought about how we can improve, by all means, hit that feedback button, please. So with that said, I'm going to go on ahead and I'm going to go back into slideshow. And thank goodness it picked up where we left off. So now I'm going to go over a tool that, in contrast to our expert-based opinion tool, is based rather on modeling, and that is CCNCalc, aka the cover crop nitrogen calculator. So originally, this beastie started out as a tool developed by the University of Georgia, Julia Gaskin and Miguel Cabrera and that group. And then with their permission and with their involvement, the Precision Sustainable Ag team took this calculator and turned it into CCNCalc. And so on the left, you can see the original interface. And on the right, you can see the web-based interface. And so this is very much based on work that has been expanded based on work the PSA is doing. And I'm not going to belabor this part as much as I have the last part, because a lot of you guys are involved in this work. This is what, CE1, I think, a lot of it. But basically, it does bear mentioning what has been done to broaden the inference domain of this model and the tool that the model is applied to. Originally, this tool was based on the Series N submodel that's been modified and adapted to adequately capture surface residue decomposition dynamics. And then we further modified and adapted this tool based on a broad range of the on-farm research that folks have been doing with the litter bags. So here you're seeing some of those on-farm sites where we've got the strip trials, plus and minus cover crops. And, you know, there's been a lot of work done with these litter bags, a lot of work done, where they've monitored the decomposition and then shoved the data into the models to figure out which factors are most important to make the tool work. Right now we're in over 26 states, I think. So this work just keeps expanding. So this is a rather complex chart, and my thanks to Stephen for letting me borrow it, because this and the preceding slide came from him. But it's a really useful way of seeing how they worked through the modifications and adaptations of the original Series N model that was used. So you can see the inputs on the left with cover crops, quantification of biomass and nitrogen concentration in the mulch. So literally like forage testing, forage quality testing, estimating the range of carbon chemistries within the residue. And, you know, and it turns out that residue water content is a big deal too. So for these surface residue decomposition dynamics, moisture is the big driver. It turns out that air humidity, which influences a lot, that's not quite the right word, involves a lot, including dew, rainfall, and air temperature, really drives mulch moisture dynamics. So they looked at all of this and ultimately realized that developing that weather API was something they had to do. The weather API, I think, was originally developed for this tool. It's nice that we were able to put it in the species selector tool too, but that API integrates weather data to help inform the tool so that they can parameterize the model, because moisture especially is such a big deal in combination with the nitrogen and carbon content of the residue. They aggregated publicly available weather data, which is hourly usually, a huge amount of data. And then they built the weather API that feeds the tool to estimate decomp dynamics. They also pull in Surgo data, which is pretty cool. They use soil organic carbon and They're finding that the carbon acts as a source of soil inorganic N that potentially can adjust the decomposition of the surface residue, especially of low quality surface residues. I apologize, I am reading a cheat sheet over here. I'm not a modeler by nature. Mad props to Resham and Rick and the rest of the UGA group for putting this together, because it's a really cool tool. And it's really awesome to be able to see a tool that's run based on modeling instead of, you know, the expert opinion. And of course, this work continues because they've got it done for, I believe it's untilled, and now they're working on tilled systems. We'll get to that in a minute with the demo. But anyway, here's a summary, and this is where things pick back up. So CC-NCalc effectively estimates the decomposition and nitrogen mineralization. The mulch model was calibrated and validated across a wide range of soil and climate and management scenarios. Thank you to everybody in PSA who has participated in this work. And we continue to expand into the Midwest and the Western US. I personally think the Western US is going to be even more interesting just because they're dry land. And man, I mean, when moisture is important, what happens when you take moisture, you know, I don't want to say out of the equation, but what happens when moisture is less common in that environment? Can't wait to see. So in any case, I'm again going to jump out of the PowerPoint and go to a tool. In this case, the address is https://cc-ncalc.org. I again encourage folks to ignore me, pull up this address, and play with the tool while I'm talking. I will say, here's a cheat sheet. So this tool is meant to be used in combination with forage quality analysis from like a lab. And if you don't have that, you might have to kind of, you know, come up with the numbers for yourself, which is probably a pain because, or at least I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But you don't actually have to do that because we've got 2 example scenarios already pre-programmed into this. And so, for example, you can pick grass or legume, just go up to this box on the right and pick one or the other. And so, as with the species selector tool, you can add your address and you can even name your field. And then you go back and click next, and it pre-fills the organic matter percentage for your soil and your bulk density and the soil inorganic N. You can technically alter these. You may get funky results if you do, but by all means, please play with these tools. You can put in your cover crop termination. Your species is assumed in this example to be rye. It assumes dry biomass because this is the example case. Water content at termination is in here too. You can adjust values based on the lab results or if you just want to play with it, but basically there's several, you know, forage type values that can be input here, carbohydrates and lignin and whatnot, that the model takes into account. You can also put in your cash crop planting date. This example assumes corn, your yield goal, and your target nitrogen fertilizer rate. And then finally, the output. The output. I'm wondering if we've crashed the site. I wonder how many of you listen to me and actually are messing with this right now. Well, we'll wait a second. While we wait a second, I can point out that like with the species selector tool on the landing page, you do have an about page that you can go to and a feedback page that you can go to that give you information respectively about the tool itself and also allow you to provide feedback. I'm gonna try this again. Okay, except that this time I'm gonna go faster because I've already walked you through it. So can we just jump to output? There's one more thing I can try beyond this. And if this doesn't work, then what I'm gonna do is I'll send a quick email to Rick in the group on Slack and let them know that we crashed it somehow. Okay. So anyway, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to Chrome and I'm gonna turn off do not mess with JavaScript. Clear browsing data. Okay, I have to get to the JavaScript point, because usually JavaScript has to run for things like this to run. And if you disallow it, you have less problems reading the paper. You didn't learn that from me. Okay, let's see if it's a Chrome versus Mozilla problem. Well, I guess that's going to be a Slack message. My apologies. Anyway, the end result is that this output, I wish I had thought to take screenshots before I came here. I'll remember that for future presentations. But the output is really clean and really beautiful, and it shows you how much residue from the cover crop is remaining at any given point after cover crop termination. And you can slide your cursor along it and get, very specific details. You don't have to eyeball the graph. It'll actually, a box will pop up that'll tell you you've got 50 pounds remaining 16 weeks after cover crop termination and whatnot. And then if you click on the other tab, it tells you how much nitrogen is being released, and it also tells you how much nitrogen you can credit to the cover crop, and so how much you should apply to reach your preferred target rate. And so with that said, I can go on ahead and briefly jump back into my PowerPoint. And I'd like to acknowledge the 50 plus experts that have been involved with the development of these tools, everything from the underlying data to alpha and beta testing, which can be, you run into bugs, man, and bugs are frustrating, but we rely on our testers to help us find those bugs so that we can release a solid minimum viable product. And so we do thank those. We also thank our funders, and I strongly encourage anyone who's giving a presentation related to PSA to remember that we do need to acknowledge our funders so that the reporting is easier, if nothing else. And with that said, here's my email. My inbox is always open, and I'd be happy to take any questions.